We are now at the story of Abraham, considered the father of three faiths: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Sometimes those three faiths are called the Abrahamic religions. Abram, his name is now Abram, went out from Ur of the Chaldeans to go to the land of Canaan. But when they came to Haran, they settled there. And a couple notes on historicity. Yes, there is a city called Ur, and there's an area called Haran. So there is historicity of these places. But we are told that Ur was not inhabited by Chaldeans until 1,000 years later than the purported events of this story. So let us look at this phrase, Ur of the Chaldeans. Spicer, a scholar, notes that we cannot locate the Chaldeans in this area until 1000 BCE. So the phrase the Ur of Chaldeans is something that probably occurred after 1000 BCE, and it is really not accurate for the time of Abraham. Abraham is said to live in Haran, and Haran is a historical area northwest of Ur, and it is associated with a group of people called the Hurrians. And that is the cultural context of the area of Haran. Spicer notes that the city of Ur is never ascribed to the Chaldeans in many, many thousands of cuneiform records that we have from that city. The story of Abraham starts rather abruptly. Yahweh talks to Abraham and gives him a command. Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land I will show you. I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. So here we have this promise from Yahweh. And I want to raise a theological point, a critical point, a spiritual point. What is the nature of this religion? What is important? Um, we don't know that this is historically accurate, so there's very little historicity we can rely on. Why would this be considered a spiritually good thing for anyone to do, to just follow these instructions from the Lord? How is Abraham getting this message? Is it in a dream? Is it an angel? Is it just an idea he has? And why is this promise of being a great nation important? That seems very political. This is not necessarily about loving God, loving other people, believing in God, or having a good theology, or acting with compassion for others. So I just note this. I want us to not accept this at face value, but be able to look at it critically and say, what does this mean? On the other hand, this is a message of willingness to find maturity, to separate yourself from your parents and your culture. And that is an example of a great mythological search for who you are, your individual worth, to individuate yourself and not be part of the society around you. In verse 7, we have a similar promise. The Lord appeared to Abram and said, to your offspring I will give this land. So he built there an altar to Yahweh. And he invoked the name of Yahweh. So again, questions about the significance of this, that the promise of this land, which is a political promise, is so important here. What does this really have to do with spirituality? And once more, we've seen that the name Yahweh is being called upon explicitly. So the name Yahweh is not necessarily reserved for a theophany or revelation to Moses. Here we are seeing Yahweh being called by name. So Abraham is told to leave his city, his culture, his family, and make a migration or pilgrimage. And what scholars have told us is that there is a lot of evidence of migration, of caravans, of trading. People were moving about the Fertile Crescent at this time, trading and seeking out their fortune. So that is very historical. So at one point, it validates this story and says, yeah, that kind of thing happened. On the other hand, it sort of makes it a common occurrence that many people were traveling. Also on historicity, many of the place names and the practices that we're seeing in the Abraham story are validated by cuneiform texts that we find in many of the cities. Mari for one, and Ur and many others. We see confirmation of place names, practices, and yet we do not really have any historicity for one individual named Abraham who actually made this journey for this reason. One scholar notes that Abraham is not mentioned much in the earlier parts of the Hebrew Scriptures. James Kugel notes that there's an absence to Abraham in the writings of Israel's 8th and 7th century prophets. So perhaps Abraham is actually an invention of the biblical writers after the exile. So this makes a lot of sense. The Israelites are in Babylon. They were forced there as workers, administering the state, as bureaucrats and traders, possibly. And they are considering moving back to the land of Canaan, back to Israel proper. So what would be a great story to tell? A story of someone in ancient times who had made that same journey. And so many scholars conclude that Abraham is not really an old story, but he was only invented in the post-exilic period. Abraham is also considered a model of monotheism, the belief in one God and one God only. Abraham is considered the man of faith par excellence. But is that really true? If you read the text, look for what Abraham says and does with regard to God. Does Abraham make claims that there only is one God? Now, certainly, Abraham is following his God and doing what his God says, but is he really claiming that there really is only one God? Many of the beliefs at this time for biblical writers, perhaps, and for many others, is sort of henotheism, that there's one God that I believe in, that I worship, that our society believes in, but there are many gods, in different cities and different nations will have their different gods. So that is perhaps not really true monotheism. And which camp is Abraham in? He doesn't really provide a theory of monotheism, that there is only one God. Here are some notes on the historicity of the events in the Abrahamic story. There is a town called Nutsi in Mesopotamia, and this mentions the cuneiform tablets from this town mention several of the customs here. There is an oral will of Isaac on his deathbed, and that is acceptable according to the legal practices of Nutsi. Also, the sale of a birthright, the protected position of a slave who gave birth to a son, are both known at Nutsi and the law code of Hammurabi. So there are lots of historically accurate practices in the Abraham story, but at the same time, we have no actual evidence of Abraham or his family. So there's a famine in the land, and Abram and Sarai go into Egypt. But they are afraid that Abram will be killed and Sarai will be married to Prince. So Abraham says, say that you are my sister, so that it may go well with me because of you, and that my life may be spared. So this account in chapter 12 brings up a lot of issues. Why is Abraham lying, pretending this? What is the relationship with Sarai and the officials? It raises a lot of issues. E. A. Spicer offers a very interesting way of looking at this idea that Sarai is both a sister and wife of Abram. And this goes back to the practices at Haran, the practices of Hurrian society. This is a common theme in Genesis, the wife-sister theme. And it turns out in Hurrian society that you could actually adopt your wife as a sister. Now, why would you do that? And the reason is because being a sister provides you many more legal protections. And so a wife might very well want that, her family would want that. So this idea is not really related to incest, according to this interpretation, but this is a legal way of making a wife a legal sister by adoption. And perhaps the biblical writers are wanting to explain that. Why is Abram claiming Sarai as his sister?